Geordie Vining.
Right. The 2-hour presentation. James said, yeah, I should talk for a half hour, 45 minutes, and then we'll have a little question and answer period afterwards. If anyone needs or wants to go, such as my wife Francesca, it's perfectly acceptable to depart. No hard feelings at all. If you don't mind maybe silencing these pocket computers, that's always helpful, just to not have ringtones going off as we talk tonight. All right. Expanding the spotlight. Let's see if I can get this pointer working here. There we go. Can everyone hear me in the back? Yeah? Okay, good. Expanding the spotlight, Black Mariners during the Age of Sail. This is part, from my perspective, of the Newburyport Black History Initiative, which I'll talk about a little bit in a minute or two. But this presentation and Newburyport's Black History Initiative is what we've been calling hidden history. Newburyport prides itself on its maritime history pretty clearly, certainly within this group here at the Custom House and more widely in the Newburyport population. I'm always aware that all our shipyards and our wharves, they're long gone, they're buried, they've been transformed, but they're still, they certainly still seem to be part of our lives. We remember their stories, they're part of our identity, our collective identity. What I'd like to talk to you about tonight is that Black Mariners were really at the heart of this maritime legacy. And they've received barely a footnote until recently, and that's something we're trying to change a little bit. The numbers did vary by port, but according to Jeffrey Bolster and some other historians, nearly 1 in 5 American sailors was Black during this era. I think that comes as a surprise to a lot of people, at least a lot of people I've spoken with, who have a vision of a white sailor from this period. And the sheer number of Black sailors is something that I think people need to grapple with from this era. There were tens of thousands of Black sailors who were sailing on all these different vessels, merchant vessels, fishing ships, whalers, warships. In the Civil War, the percentage is even higher. The U.S. Navy was heavily dependent on Black sailors. At the peak, in 1864, it was 23%. Nearly 1 in 4 sailors was Black in the U.S. Navy. And that is double the proportion in the U.S. Army. There's 180,000 Black soldiers in the U.S. Army, but they were approximately 5% of the Army. So, or 12%, I'm sorry. So a very significant presence. I think it's time to return Black Mariners to center stage, where they belong. They live big lives, often at great cost, as I'm going to talk about a little bit tonight. They made a difference for us all. So the Newburyport Black History Initiative, I'm Kabria Baumgartner. Dr. Baumgartner is my colleague in this endeavor. She's up front. She's a local resident, an historian, and a professor at Northeastern. We've worked together for the past couple of years on this project, as well as with Sid Rashke, who couldn't be here tonight, and a lot of other local historians and other folks. The basic mission of this initiative is to affirm Black history and belonging in Newburyport, and to illuminate histories that have largely been overlooked or forgotten, and try to ensure that these stories are publicly accessible to a broad audience, whether it's through these signs we're putting out town, whether it's through lectures, events, and so forth. The main focus is the signs. We've got about 5 of them up now, and we have another 5 or 6 coming this year. They're featuring stories of Black Americans in Newburyport from the 18th, 19th and 20th centuries. We have a website on part of the city website. Some of you may have visited it, but we've been trying to expand beyond the signs to videos, articles. There's going to be another article in the fall by Cabria in the Newburyport magazine. We've had indoor displays. I was just talking to some people tonight about the old burying ground and the Once Known project that Liz and others helped us on. So we're trying to do a lot of different work along these lines. I would say that the majority of these signs feature black mariners because that was the work that so many black men did in this age. This is going to be the sign that's going to go on the central waterfront here, and this is the sign that's in Brown Square about Newburyport's black soldiers and sailors, featuring black mariners. But all the other signs reference black mariners because it was such a common theme. So tonight, I'm trying to bring home the existence and the sheer number of black mariners during this age of sail. I'd also like to talk about some of the exceptional dangers that were faced by these sailors. This is a horribly dangerous profession, I think, as most of you in this room know. Even more so for black sailors because of the reverse Underground Railroad, as well as the Negro Seaman Acts down south. I'm also going to try to give a little profile of an individual Navy sailor and describe 2 voyages by Newbury ships that had all black crews. So, 18th and 19th centuries, I think as this group in particular knows well, the maritime economy really drove the overall economy in Massachusetts and throughout the country. The port of Newburyport drew black sailors from throughout the region. So Newburyport has always had a small black population, with many of them being sailors, being mariners. But black sailors were coming to Newburyport and sailing on Newbury ships from all over the region. From just in terms of Massachusetts, from the Cape and the islands, from the South Coast, on up into New Hampshire and Maine, and farther out. To date, we are not aware of any historic photographs that have been preserved of black mariners here in Newburyport. I think that's very unfortunate. So that is a common theme with this research, whether it's about black sailors or many other parts of black history in Newburyport. A lot of this history hasn't been recorded, a lot of it hasn't been preserved. We have bits and pieces. So the images that I'm showing you on the screen here are generally illustrating black sailors during this time period. This particular picture, this is up in Maine actually. This is the crew of a huge 6-masted schooner called the Wyoming. So, as I think I noted, seafaring was really one of the primary occupations for black men in this era. The representation of shipboard is proportionally far greater than in Massachusetts or New England, black men in the general population. The profession entailed really quite incredible hardship and danger, and black sailors face a lot more risk than their white crewmates. I chose this picture. This is a very famous picture of Watson and the Shark. A lot of you probably recognize that image by John Singleton Copley, but I think of the black sailor there, and there's a lot of sharks, metaphorical and real, circling black sailors in this era. This is just an example. So in the Newburyport, the local newspaper, there was a regular column every day called Disasters. The shipping journal had disasters, and they would tell you, they would reference disaster after disaster. It is quite incredible reading. So I summarized a couple of them, but I could give a whole presentation just on disasters and the range of disasters. Heavy gales knocking seamen overboard, sailors falling from aloft to their death, crippled ships drifting, running out of provisions, ships burning, colliding, found floating bottom up, ships running aground, dashed to pieces, killing everyone on board. huge number of ships lost at sea. So this was a dangerous profession for everyone who did it. And you know, as I work away at my computer in City Hall, thinking about this kind of work, it is an eye-opener about what the risks that these men took. So the opportunities at sea, however, really outweighed those hardships and risks in the 19th century for a lot of black men. There was reliable employment, there was steady pay. The pay was actually usually pretty similar to white mariners. And that was all fairly different from all the constraints, all the limitations on land in terms of what black men could do for work. Working as a mariner meant international travel, and there actually seemed to be, as far as we can tell, sort of a rough equality among the crew underneath the dictatorial captain. And there is certainly still plenty of racism in this era, and white sailors in this era, for instance, they certainly loved their blackface minstrel shows. But there does seem to be, more so than on land, a rough sense of equality of sailors all doing the same work. You know, looking through the census records from this era, it seems that about half of Newburyport, the black men who called Newburyport home, they worked as mariners during the mid-19th century. You know, I circled this. You know, it's listing out these men's names. Here's this column with B, 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 B for black, and mariner, 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 mariner. This fellow's from Suriname originally. Others are from Delaware and Rhode Island in terms of where they were originally born. A lot of people aren't captured on these census records because they're often year-long voyages. And, but it gives you a little snapshot, a sense of how many people were in this profession. In terms of the risks, as I noted, there's the reverse Underground Railroad and incarcerations on their ports. This is a picture from the Anti-Slavery Almanac of 1839, Northern freemen enslaved by Northern hands. This is a fairly well-known engraving. I actually found this, I found this same picture being used as an example down south, I think it was in Georgia, of slave patrollers capturing an escaped slave, so to speak. And they had conveniently sort of taken away all the rest of the information about, no, this is an actual event of this the reverse happening. A free man being captured and sold into slavery. A lot of us, I believe, have heard of the Underground Railroad, and that's celebrated here in Newburyport to a certain extent. I don't know how many people are aware of the reverse Underground Railroad. It's a mirror version of the Underground Railroad. So where you had the clandestine network moving people north, trying to move people towards freedom, you had a similar sized network of people being captured and kidnapped and moved south. It's and to be sold and enslaved in the South. There's some historians such as Richard Bell and David Blight that have been bringing this to the world's attention. This is from one of Richard Bell's talks about one of the boys. A lot of people who were kidnapped were children, and it turned out to be thousands of people in the early 19th century kidnapped and taken. Here in Newburyport, there seems to be an example of that. So in the Liberator, in Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, there are some affidavits published from the uncle and the mother of this boy named James Hall. He's a teenager, James Hall, about 19 years old. He lived in Exeter, New Hampshire. And the affidavits are published from his uncle and his mother that he was forcibly taken from his home. He was brought to a Newburyport jail, and then the next day he was forced onto a Newburyport ship called the Wallace, and he was forced to work as a cook on a voyage south. And then witnesses of people who knew James later saw him and saw that he was sold and enslaved in Alexandria, Virginia, and he never returned home. This was published in the Liberator and some other places. And the captain, Isaac Stone, he was also given some space in the Liberator to respond. So he was very indignant, and he claimed that young James Hall had been given wages in advance and James had run away, so he'd been arrested, and that he then seemed to be very happy on the ship, and they let him off when they got to Alexandria, Virginia, and he deserted, and so they left and don't know what happened to it. From what I've read and researched, it would have been highly unusual to advance money directly to a sailor before one of these voyages, particularly a black teenager in 1815. And so is the captain telling lies? Is he just indifferent to the fate of this young man? The result seems to be pretty much the same. I have read accounts and seen documentation throughout the country of plenty of other captains selling and enslaving black sailors, and then they just simply claim they deserted. I don't know what happened to them. So that happened here in Newburyport. Just a couple of other bits of information about that. James's father was a fellow named Jude Hall. He was a Revolutionary War veteran. He fought at Bunker Hill, he was at Valley Forge, and so forth. This family was cursed. James Hall's brother, who was also a sailor named William Hall, he sailed out of Newburyport, and he was also sold as a slave in the West Indies. He escaped eventually. He contacted his mother, Rhoda. 20 years later, his father had died by that point. Another brother, Aaron Hall, another sailor, he went on a voyage. He came back to Providence, Rhode Island. The captain claimed that he owed money to the captain, and he was kidnapped, pulled back to sea, and he was never heard from again by his family. This happened over and over and over again. Shifting gears, the Negro Seaman Acts in the southern ports. The southern ports were very busy, and they posed particular dangers for black mariners. It was very hard if you were a black sailor not to go to a southern port. Ships, that's where trade was going constantly. And between 1822 and 1865, at the end of the Civil War, nearly all the southern coastal states, they codified and enforced what are called the Negro Seaman Acts, which quarantined black mariners. This is the unique group of laws that aimed at a specific occupational group. The Southern lawmakers, they explicitly characterized black mariners as carrying what they called a moral contagion. So they needed to quarantine them because they didn't want to spread the moral contagion. They said every black sailor carries the whiff of abolitionism and autonomy. We cannot have them talking to the local enslaved people. This moral contagion might be transmitted. So what the Negro Seaman Acts required was that a ship comes into port, what happens? All the black sailors have to go out of prison. Not the white sailors, they just go off into port and do whatever white sailors do in ports. But the black sailors and the passengers actually, when they arrive, they're incarcerated, and then the bill is given to the captain of the ship. These incarcerated black sailors were shackled. They were forced to work on chain gangs. They were whipped. This could go on for days. This could go on for weeks. Their captains sometimes weren't very happy about this, not for the sake of the sailor, but for the sake of their own profits, and they sometimes docked the jail fees from the sailors' wages. And sometimes the captains refused to pay at all, or they just left without them, and left them behind. And those black sailors could be jailed indefinitely, or they could be sold. Historians say about 20,000 dark-skinned sailors were imprisoned in these years. This was a major issue during those decades leading up to the Civil War. There was all sorts of protests, there was litigation from any number of northern states as well as from Great Britain. It was really part of the whole rolling constitutional crisis. It cut to the core of what it meant to be a citizen. And the federal courts said this was not allowable. The states did it anyway. This was all leading up to the great crisis of the Civil War. I read that in 1844, a Massachusetts agent was dispatched to South Carolina to gather information for some ongoing litigation, and some mobs in Charleston forced him to flee. Charleston is a lovely destination. My wife and daughter just went there, but it has quite a history along these lines a century or two ago. And the Newburyport Acts, this is only resolved by the Civil War. This little article here is talking about the sale of one of the ships, the Montana. This is the Montana right up here, with an all-black crew, and it's sailing. The blacks come here from Boston and New Bedford. Their sailing for the South indicates the change in their social and political condition. Formerly, shipmasters hesitated on taking them, as they were deprived of their services in southern ports and obliged to pay their board in jail. Thank God that is all passed. I was interested to see that the Boston paper, the Boston Daily Advertiser, reproduced this same message. For some reason, they did not include "Thank God that is all passed." Interesting.
What's the date of that?
This is February 2nd, 1866. So shortly after the Civil War, months after it ended. The Civil War, black men in navy blue. One point I was interested in making was, for instance, there's an historian named Ty Sidgley who used to be a historian at West Point. He is very focused on using terminology of the U.S. Navy as opposed to the Union Navy. His point is that there's been a continuous United States, and that the Union and the use of terms like Union and Confederate, which I grew up using, suggests two equal sides as opposed to one of these sides rebelling against the U.S. government, rebelling and killing people in the U.S. Navy and the U.S. Army. So I thought I'm using the terms U.S. Navy and U.S. Army. About 19,000 black men served in the U.S. Navy by the end of the Civil War. And the U.S. Navy at that time was actually integrated, unlike the Army. Integrated, but hardly equal. And most of the black sailors were assigned the lowest rank possible of so-called landsmen, regardless of their experience. There's a number of black men who enlisted in the U.S. Navy from Newburyport. I say men, but for instance, John Osborne and William Osborne were teenagers, teenage brothers. George Paul, Augustus Cambridge, and Evans Covington. Evans Covington was in this battle for New Orleans in April 1862 on the USS Richmond. Evans Covington is the sailor that I just wanted to talk about for a few minutes. A Civil War U.S. Navy sailor and U.S. Army soldier. This is at Atkinson Common, as many of you presumably know. There's a large memorial to Newburyport's quota, all the soldiers and sailors that came from Newburyport. So there's Evan Covington's name right there. He married a 19-year-old young woman named Victoria Ambush in 1859. He was 34 years old. He had worked as a barber, one of the other professions. That's one of the other few professions black men could work in this era. And as a steward. Less than a year after he got married, he enlists in Boston in the U.S. Navy when the war breaks out, July 27, 1860. This is the enlistments at Boston, and this is his name and his information, his height, and so forth. And he signs up for a 3-year term. The enlistment record says here that he has 14 years of nautical experience, and he, like the others, is given the lowest rank of landsman. This is a picture of the USS Richmond. That was the ship that he was assigned to, and part of the fleet that fought and seized New Orleans in 1862. He mustered out of the U.S. Navy at the end of that 3-year term in 1863, and then he essentially immediately re-enlists as a soldier in the famous black 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry Regiment. This is made famous in contemporary times by the movie Glory, which a lot of you may have seen. Very famous, the first all-volunteer, black volunteer regiment. This is a poster, 2 colored men, 54th Regiment, offering a so-called bounty to sign up and offering pay of $13 a month, etc., aid to families, trying to get people to sign up. Evans Covington, he went down and fought in South Carolina, but then the records say that he was sent to the Government Asylum for the Insane. That's the name of the institution, which I find quite a dramatically named institution. And a lot of Civil War soldiers were driven insane by their experiences. This particular institution is in Washington, D.C. He died there in September in 1864, and he's buried there on the grounds. There's his gravestone. There's a military record for him which indicates that the U.S. never provided that so-called bounty, that enlistment pay. Forgot to, maybe. It also says that Evans owed money to the Army for the clothing that was issued to him. So that shows you how much thanks some of these institutions were giving the people who were doing the fighting. Victoria Covington, a very young woman here back in Newburyport, she repeatedly applies to the federal government for a widow's pension and for Evans back pay, and she is repeatedly denied. And the U.S., the federal government essentially says, well, he was insane, we don't know why he was insane, maybe he was insane for reasons other than the war, so we don't owe you anything. This happened a lot with a lot of black soldiers and sailors. Decades later, there was legislation passed that allowed for pensions to everyone, but it took quite a long time. Shifting gears, all-black crews in Newburyport. I'm going to talk about 2 of them. One is called a Newburyport ship called the Sonora in 1863, during the war, during the Civil War. So merchant ships continued to sail out of Newburyport, plying their trade internationally during the war. And one example was this fairly large ship, the Sonora, which was built in 1853 by the John Currier Jr., the famous shipbuilder. Reports published in the History of the Marine Society of Newburyport by both the captain and the first mate talk about the fate of this ship. So in 1863, the Sonora was sailing with an all-black crew and white Newburyport officers, and they were off the coast of Malaysia, and they were attacked by a Confederate privateer called the Alabama. This is the captain. Raphael Stone's the commander of the Alabama. This ship really wreaked havoc with a lot of shipping, burning and plundering a lot of merchant ships. According to the first mate and the captain, the privateer not only plundered and then burned the Sonora, but it's written right there in the report, employing the N-word, cast all the sailors adrift in small boats. Typically, people were landed on shore and safely, and while the ships were looted or destroyed. Not in this case. And there was a black sailor who's described in these accounts named Charles S., who describes having to make their way 80 miles to the port of Malacca in safety. The Montana. picture is of the Montana entering Liverpool, England, which you can see over in the side here. I did a little bit of sleuthing. William Gay York had a particular style he liked to employ for these ships. You can see that on the wall here too. You have to start looking closely for distinctions between these ships. But he liked using Liverpool as the setting for these ships with these distinctive structures in the background. The Montana was built also in the John J. Currier Jr. shipyard. It was the 76th vessel that was built there. This photo is of the shipyard, courtesy of the Archival Center in the Newburyport Public Library, of some of these massive ships being built. Those are some of the workers right down here, the carriage. When this ship was built, in January 1866, there was a long and very admiring description in the local newspaper, the Newburyport Daily Herald, describing this as a beautiful, near-perfect ship. And it lovingly described the cabin made with chestnut, mahogany panels, rosewood pilasters. This was apparently quite a beautiful ship. And as I noted before, a few days later, this article came out on February 2nd, noting that all the sailors will be Negroes for the Montana's maiden voyage from Newburyport City Wharf with white officers, which was the typical approach back then. And I already read this quote about the black sailors right after the Civil War. So the Newburyport Daily Herald then periodically tracked the Montana's year-long maiden voyage. So here, for instance, is something in the shipping journal which notes that the ship Montana with Captain Moore is arriving at Mobile, Alabama, their first stop in February. And then a little bit later, the Montana clears Mobile, Alabama, and sails across the ocean for Liverpool, England, in April 1866. And then, after doing their business in Liverpool, they sail outward for Calcutta, India, which is now pronounced Kolkata, but a lot of us know it as Calcutta, in July of that year. That is a long voyage from Liverpool to Calcutta. And the captain telegrammed back to Newburyport proudly to say, "We accomplished the shortest passage ever made by a sailing vessel between Liverpool and Calcutta." The Captain Moore and his crew of black men from New Bedford and other cities and towns in Massachusetts, a journey of over 8,600 nautical miles on the sailing ship in 85 days. 85 days at sea to their next port. And then the local newspapers showed the Montana sailing from Calcutta back towards Boston in January 1867, a long journey. There's a little map we made just demonstrating the reach of that year-long trip. Black mariners in this era braved turbulent seas and turbulent times. So I'm wrapping up. There are a lot more stories that are tucked away and buried in the archives. You know, just as a very quick summary of some of the things I was trying to touch on, the whaling fishery, that really went into decline in the late 19th century and the early 20th centuries. And as that industry went in decline, black mariners actually gained more and more opportunity to act as captains and as owners. And but black participation in the overall marine industry really started to go into significant decline in the early 20th century. There was some significant racism in the white seamen's unions. Jim Crow was trying to clamp down on the United States and segregation. And the U.S. Navy, that had been this integrated force, segregated, and then they almost entirely curtailed opportunities for black sailors for many, many decades. It was a very long voyage to the World War II era where that started to be reversed and beyond. The last thought maybe I would try to leave you with is, and James was alluding to this early on, our primary image and our concept of the maritime legacy in Newburyport as well as the United States basically looks like this. This is what we think of. There's the captain, and there's a white sailor right behind him. When this is really what it should look like. So in this current era, Black history is under attack across the country. So once again, I would say, I would let us return Black mariners where they belong to center stage and continue to illuminate histories that have been overlooked or forgotten until now. Good history is a good foundation for a better present and future. This is a quote that I particularly love from John Hope Franklin. Thank you very much. Sorry if I went over time. So, a few minutes of question and answer. And again, if anyone needs to leave because they're about to faint or they have to go and have dinner, please feel free. Questions?
So, I'm not familiar until tonight about the reverse underground railroad. And I guess my question is, I'm not familiar. These were local Newbury residents that were partaking, or were these Southerners that had come up here and were boarded and then?
So I'm not sure if everyone heard the question, but she's asking about the reverse underground railroad and who is perpetrating it, essentially. Is it Southern agents coming up, or is it local people from the north? It was actually both. So that you had Southern agents coming up, supposedly looking for runaways. But the reverse underground railroad was, the documentation is local gangs, essentially, who were in it for profit, in it for the profit motive, seeing that they could make money and do it with relative impunity.
So I guess my next question is, what was the response of the local community to those gangs? We have any knowledge of that?
Yeah, the local response was mixed. There was a great deal of indifference to the fate of some of these people. But as there's also documentation of significant confrontations as people realized what was happening underneath their noses. So a little bit of a mixed story. Let's see, in the back there. Yeah.
Was the reason they were going back down south because of shipping like sugar and products like that that were being imported into the middle of the country?
Yes, cotton in particular, other goods. There was no way to, the economy, even though the politics of this century was incredibly polarized, the economy was completely integrated. So the shipping was constantly going back and forth. And there was, sometimes Black mariners did everything they could to resist going to these destinations, but it was at their peril to try to resist.
Yeah, you can indulge me. I thought I was going to be uplifted by your presentation. And I'm finding it extremely depressing. The history of Newburyport and slavery is that we were building ships for slavery, to bring slaves to America. It is clear that the clipper ships were built to transport humans. And from your point, from your presentation, it's clear that the ship owners were taking advantage of Black Americans because the Black people were taking these jobs because it was what's available, and it was better than nothing. And I'm sorry, the name of the ship on
Montana.
the Montana had an all-black crew, possibly because, I I mean, was that because they were trying to be altruistic, or was it because they had cheap labor?
It's hard to know in terms of the motivations. Some have suggested that those owners were making a political point. The war is over. The Negro Seaman Acts are no more. We can actually have black sailors go down to places like Mobile, Alabama, unload, take on this cotton and do trade over to England. So it's like everything, it's a mixed story. I'm sorry to be a downer. In terms of clipper ships, certainly not all of these ships were slave ships. Some local historians like Lee Woodworth have found specific documentation about Newburyport ship owners and the slave trade. That was actually relatively uncommon to be directly involved with that. But there's plenty of other examples of complicity, if you want to use that word, for a host of other abuses. So I don't want to be a downer, but I also believe in opening our eyes to what happened in this community, where the wealth came from, and how we got here today.
Is or was there a disparity in the amount of money that a whaler would have, because they were going not south but to other parts of the globe, to a black sailor and a white sailor? Do you have any
The
information?
disparity between their wages,
Yes.
the white versus the black. So from what we can tell, there was a rough parity in terms of wages, which was unlike the situation on most landside jobs. So there seemed to be an acknowledgement that people were doing the same work and being paid relatively the same amount of money. So that seems to be one of the reasons why this work was attractive, as well as one of the only games in town for people.
What was the cargo going from the U.S. to Liverpool, and from Liverpool to Calcutta, Calcutta back to the U.S.?
So we don't have too much information on that. I'm pretty sure they were picking up cotton down in Mobile, Alabama, and taking that over to Liverpool. And then in terms of what goods they were bringing from England over to Calcutta, that wasn't recorded, so I don't have the answer on that. Great new research project. Get in touch and we'll figure that out.
Were people like William Lloyd Garrison aware of the reverse railroad and were they ready about it?
Yes, so I don't know if everyone heard the question. Was William Lloyd Garrison aware of the reverse Underground Railroad, and did he promote it? So that was what he wanted to use his newspaper as a forum to publicize this. So that's why he encouraged these affidavits from the family to be printed in his newspaper, and he wanted this talked about. So yes, he was well aware of it.
So the follow-up to this jumps into this question about the potential wage disparity. Even if there wasn't a wage disparity, whites might have been promoted to higher levels on the ship, where black people would never have done. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, so there were, in limited circumstances, and James is referring to a black captain, early in the 19th century, especially in the whaling industry, that seemed to be more of a possibility. In the rest of the maritime industry, for the most part, you're just crew, and the officers are always white. So there are some exceptions to that, but that is certainly the case.
I just wanted a question of fact. I can't remember when the Fugitive Slave Law was passed.
When was the Fugitive Slave Law passed? 1850. Career reminds me.
Thank you.
Yeah, which inflamed things even more for the country. James.
Geordie, in Nantucket, there was just out of town, outside of Main Street, there was an area called New Guinea, and it was where Native Americans and also the black community, Cape Verdeans lived. Where was, I presume it must be a similar community in Newburyport? Where was that?
That was our first interpretive sign, and that neighborhood was also called Guinea. It wasn't called Guinea, but it was called Guinea Village here in Newburyport. So we have a sign on our rail trail near the Low Street Bridge, for those of you who have walked or biked or are familiar with the rail trail. So that neighborhood was almost literally across the tracks, I suppose, but that neighborhood was down in that Low Street, Auburn Street, Greenleaf Street area. And so in the 18th and 19th centuries, that was the black neighborhood in Newburyport. And you can read all about it on the sign, but as there was sort of a slow dismissal of slavery in Massachusetts, a lot of black people in the region gathered in Newburyport. There were very few in Salisbury or Amesbury, the surrounding towns. This was where the community was. And then that community slowly trickled out as politics changed and the 19th century went on, and it became less of a cohesive place. But there are sailors documented who came from New Guinea down in Nantucket and came to Newburyport as sailors. So.
We called that Guinea Bridge when I was a kid.
Exactly, Guinea
It was always
Bridge.
Guinea Bridge.
And people really didn't know why it was called Guinea Bridge. And again, as we talked about on the sign, it was called Guinea Bridge because that was the association with the black residents of that neighborhood.
Were they restricted to that neighborhood?
They weren't restricted, we don't think, in terms of you cannot live anywhere else. It's a little, the records are very spotty, very fragmented, and we really only have the words of the mainstream white community, not the people who live there. So it's hard to tell, but we do find records of the concentration of people there starting to move out to different parts of Newburyport, different parts of the community. And so one can speculate that perhaps it was a supportive community in a sea of white New England. I'd like to think that in a more positive way, as opposed to just somewhere that was a segregated neighborhood. It's probably a little bit of both.
I'm not sure of the dates, but there's some history of people having slaves in Newburyport as housekeepers and
Oh, yes.
what have you. Is there an overlap of in Newburyport of some people having slaves and there also being free slaves who are maybe working in the maritime industry, in the maritime business?
That is certainly, the short answer is yes. There was always some overlap of free people in the north with enslaved people. The numbers are very small in New England, surprisingly small, maybe to today's eyes, well before the great migrations that came up from the south after the Civil War and in the early 20th century. But there was always that sort of overlap, yes.
Just for the record, the house I live in now on Madison Street, during the 1800s, there was a black couple who lived there.
Okay.
So they weren't all just in that section.
Exactly. Yeah, people were spread in different parts of town. Yeah, that's a good point. Any other questions? So, if you all are interested in following up on any of this, there's this QR code which takes you to the website that we've created and they're still trying to work on. It's also on the little poster board I put outside there. Anyone can find me, track me down in City Hall if you'd like. Thank you very much for coming out tonight.
Another round of applause, Geordie. Fantastic. Let's get this project done. It's a fantastic initiative. I wish you the best of luck and let us know how we can help. Thank you, everybody.